You are listening to KYRS Medical Lake and Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 FM, 3 o'clock Wednesday. This must be Long Waves with Gary Krug. Disclaimer here, the opinions expressed on Long Waves are solely those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of KYRS, its staff, management, or underwriters. No, certainly not. Okay. Well, this has been an interesting week all around in the news. Just about as interesting as things can get, really. I wanted to try to pull together a whole string of, I think, related issues in today's show. So I've given this the title, Reality Stinks from the Head Down. And what started me off on thinking about this was an article by Joe Clifford on Information Clearinghouse, where he discussed how if a government, if the infrastructure, if the legal and moral structure of a government is not intact, it produces a corrosive effect all the way to the bottom, affecting ordinary people. And he cited Justice Brandeis' decision in 1928 in Olmstead versus United States, which I'll take up in some detail here in a minute. But let me just begin with some observations. And I know I said I was never going to talk about the Republican presidential campaign, or I haven't said much about any of the presidential campaigns. But the rise of Trump and the response to it by some people, as always, those with a sense of humor, tend to cut right to the heart of things. And I had two comments from Wonkette that I thought were aperçus. One was, quote, "The rally in Las Vegas sounded better in the original German." Of course, a reference to the Hitler period, the Nazi period. And then there was a play on an old joke. I went to a Trump rally, and a hockey game broke out. An old joke, not terribly funny, but it's aperçu that the level of violence is far beyond anything you would expect in such a thing. In such a moment. I look at the proliferation of Islamophobia. I look at the racial tensions, this ban all the foreigners, put up fences, the whole Republican platform, whole Republican clown car of candidates trying to outdo themselves on who can sound the most ruthless and bloodthirsty, bomb their families. I mean, there was actually a serious debate, a serious discussion it wasn't a debate in any meaningful sense, but a serious discussion among the candidates over whether would you bomb their families? Would you bomb the terrorist families? Would you kill them too? This is the level we've come to. And then Trump, saying he wanted to have Muslims tagged in some way. Well, we've all seen where that went, didn't we? Back in the Nazi period. And I was thinking, where is all of this coming from? There are so many totalitarian moves. And I don't say that to frighten, and I don't say that to be inflammatory, but just descriptively, there are so many turns toward, well, maybe it's Wolin's inverted totalitarianism, but it has some appearances of real totalitarianism, which many people have marked. We see the militarization of the police, for example. SWAT teams routinely doing warrant calls. We see routinely, on thanks to the miracle of YouTube and cell phones, police violence against civilians. Now, there's always a lot of police violence against civilians, but now we see it. It's you can't hide it anymore. We have the problem of the NSA and its omnipresent surveillance. Forget the Fourth Amendment. Forget the Fifth Amendment. None of this matters because the needs of the state outweigh everything. And when Justice Brandeis had some choice words on these things, in a lot of ways, we're not doing terribly well as a country. There was recently a delegation from the UN in the U.S. of 3 women, one from Poland, one from the UK, and one from Costa Rica, who visited 3 states in the U.S. and were examining the state of women's equality in the United States. The phrase that was used was appalling. Specifically, they cited the differential in pay. They cited the near universal absence of paid maternity leave. They also cited the difficulty of women getting access to medical care, including abortions if they so choose. Well, this fits right in a way, with the violence that this country evidences against women. In fact, in the U.S., women are 11 times more likely to be killed by a gun than in any other developed nation. This is a real lived fact for a lot of people. This is not, and it should be for all of us, this is not an abstraction. We see sacrifice zones of entire cities. Chris Hedges recently did a piece on some neighborhoods in Houston that sound worse than anything Dante described in the Inferno. Hellish, hideous places. Right, we're doing so well that the city of Flint, Michigan, was poisoning children, inadvertently, mind you, with lead as they were doing, as they were in the middle of a change in how they get their water supply. Lead. And, of course, the people in Flint who were drinking this lead water were disproportionately black, and the ones who were most damaged by it were disproportionately young children. Lead does really interesting things to the mind, to the brain, to most of the organs in the body, especially to the brain, and the effects in the fetus and pregnant women are appalling. And the list goes on and on and on. Now, this has got to be unsettling to a lot of people. The lived experience of being poisoned, of being denied basic rights, of being denied equality, of having your legal rights respected by police and courts and prisons. There was a time when these systems functioned, by and large, for the community, for people. And now they function for what? Well, we've learned that numerous police departments in the country are used to raise revenue for the cities and counties. We know about the privatization of the prison industrial complex, and we know about the hideous abuses that go on inside of prisons on a routine manner. And we see the downturn of the economy and people's uncertainty about the economy. Less than half of the so-called middle class make $50,000 a year. We may become the first industrial nation in the world not to have a middle class. We're all being pushed into servitude. And everybody witnesses how the money is sucked out of our pockets, sucked out of our bank accounts, not just through taxes, but through a variety of mechanisms whereby money we invest in stocks is just stolen, where money we put into bonds and retirement accounts is stolen. This creates a lot of uncertainty among people. But this degree of uncertainty by itself, I don't think, is enough to explain why people are so out of touch with each other, why people have lost any confidence in the social fabric and the social framework, above all, in the reciprocities that are required for a just society. Well, let's look at Clifford's piece here for a bit. Clifford notes, I quote, "The actions of the national government set the example for its citizens, and it is difficult to fault citizens for following the actions of their own government. Many cannot admit, despite the overwhelming evidence, that the U.S. is lawless and out of control. It shows a disregard for human life and does anything it wishes without paying the slightest bit of attention to law." And all these paradoxes here, there's this whole right to life movement, for example, the whole anti-abortion crowd, who many people have noted are also, the pro-gun, pro-war crowd, murder by the state crowd, executions, whatever. And that's to be expected, because it lets them pretend that they really aren't the bloodthirsty murderers and accomplices to murder that they in fact are. Clifford continues, "The U.S. has illegally invaded or bombed numerous nations without the slightest threat of imminent attack." And among these he cites Panama, Grenada, Haiti, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Serbia, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, and on and on and on, with no legal justification. No legal justification at all. Might makes right. Anything and everything goes, and no one is held accountable for illegal actions. Torture? Yeah, we tortured some people. Anybody going to jail for this? No. We violate international law on a daily level. Does anybody go to jail for this? Banks violate laws all the time. The only country that actually seemed interested in reforming their banking system and putting their damned corrupt bankers in prison was Iceland, which was remarkably effective at doing that. We still have Abu Ghraib. We have the memory of waterboarding. We have all of the assassinations that our government has committed around the world, or supported, or condoned, or urged. Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest? We bomb hospitals. We bomb weddings. We bomb funerals. And we call the people killed collateral damage. Gee. What is the effect on ordinary people who witness when they actually pull their head out of their sports games and their irreality TV and whatever else is going on. What would the reaction of people be? To sit and soberly assess and acknowledge that the U.S. government is one of the greatest forces of destruction in the world, maybe the largest. And the government repeatedly lies, and it has, the very complicit mass media to help it with this. What happens when you lie to your children? After a while, your children quit believing you, and the whole of your relationship with your children is poisoned in a lot of interesting ways. What happens when a government lies incessantly to itself, to its people, to the world? The relationships become poisoned, as we're seeing globally, as we're seeing domestically. Even in the face of imminent threat, real imminent threat, such as climate change, nothing can be done about it. But if there's money to be made in destroying a country, pick Libya, pick Iraq, because some neocon ideologues have gotten it into their heads that this is what? This is a good way to make more money. This is a good way to increase the U.S. hegemony around the world. Now, think about this idea of hegemony for a minute. I know there's some people who would go, well, yeah, America should be the only big power in the world, and then we wouldn't have all these wars. Nonsense. We would have more wars. We would have more coups, and the world would be less free. Choose any example since 1945, and many before 1945, choose any example where a country the U.S. invaded is better off after. I don't think most people would agree with this. Bashar al-Assad, he's evil, we must destroy him. He's not the nicest guy in the world, but it ignores the history of Syria and of U.S. involvement in Syria. Clifford again raises the point, why should we be aghast when a mass murderer defies laws and kills innocents, when one learns by example? If it's okay for the U.S. government to ignore law, attack and kill anyone they wish for no apparent reason, why does it surprise when one of its citizens imitates the action of their government, takes the law into his or her own hands, and kills? Killing's okay if it's the enemy, if the state says they must be killed. Killing is wrong if the state didn't weigh in on that. And yet there are also powerful forces that are not the state that do weigh in on it. As we see being fired up in Donald Trump's rallies, as we see in the rhetoric of the Republican candidates. The last 4 presidents in the U.S. have bombed Iraq. They've killed 1 million people, including about 600,000 children, which I've talked about on the show before. And Americans are like, what? They have no clue. And even if they did, it doesn't ring in their heads. These kids don't count, Clifford says. They're not American. Neither were the 3 million left dead in Southeast Asia. Neither were the 1 million in Iraq. We've bombed 14 nations in the Middle East. 14 nations. Why? Because they were imminent threats to us? Really? No. No. Because the U.S. wants to create total control over the world. And they speak openly of this. They speak of U.S. exceptionalism. This is not some weird conspiracy theory. This is official policy. Right? Nobody talks about, we want to build relationships with Russia. No, evil Russia. Russia must be destroyed. Not, we want to have good relations with our brothers and sisters in China. Nope, China, evil. Russia, evil. Anything that's a threat to complete U.S. hegemony is simply evil. And look at as Clifford points out, how the U.S. defiance of law sets an example to the world community, especially among our allies. Saudi Arabia's attack on Yemen. Yemen? One of the poorest countries in the Middle East. Maybe the poorest country in the Middle East. Look at Israel's attacks, multiple, on Gaza. They call it cutting the grass. When the Saudis ran out of bombs bombing the poor civilians in Yemen, the U.S. rearmed them. The U.S. supplied Saudi Arabia with targeting information. And so what does Saudi Arabia do? They bomb civilians, they bomb hospitals. And yet, Bashar al-Assad is the evil one. Wait a minute. What about our good friends, the Saudis? And then the neo-Nazi kind of demagoguery of those clowns running for president. Clifford concludes, we know from history where the incessant hate speech took the world in the 1940s. The frightening signs of a rebirth of that disastrous, horrible, racist ideology are now prevalent in the presidential campaign. I mentioned before the emergence of various kinds of totalitarianism in the U.S. And among these is the gutting of the Constitution. And I'm not speaking of the Second Amendment, which most of the gun people don't understand at all. And that whole thing about a well-regulated militia, that, we're not even going to go there. Maybe in another life. But Brandeis was deeply concerned about an issue that was a great concern to us, and this was in 1928. The case before the Supreme Court was Olmstead versus United States, and it involved wiretapping, where some police or government agents wiretapped a phone, and then the government tried to prosecute on the basis of this wiretapped information. Brandeis, justices held that it was acceptable for the government to do this, but Brandeis made a very nuanced argument, as he often did. Let me just quote from his dissent. The makers of our Constitution undertook to secure conditions favorable to the pursuit of happiness. They recognized the significance of man's spiritual nature, of his feelings, and of his intellect. They knew that only a part of the pain, pleasure, and satisfactions of life are to be found in material things. They sought to protect Americans in their beliefs, their thoughts, their emotions, and their sensations. They conferred, as against the government, the right to be left alone, the most comprehensive of rights and the right most valued by civilized men. Tough words. Tough words. The right to be left alone. So every unjustifiable intrusion of government upon the privacy of the individual, he says, quote, must be deemed a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Of course, that was back when we had a Constitution that people actually paid attention to. He continues, though, as Justice Brandeis again. Experience should teach us to be most on our guard to protect liberty when the government's purposes are beneficent. In other words, when they're going to save us from terror, or save us from extremists, or whatever they've cooked up that's going to be for our benefit. We should then be most on our guard, said Brandeis. Quote, men born to freedom are naturally alert to repel invasion of their liberty by evil-minded rulers. The greatest dangers to liberty lurk in the insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning, but without understanding. And as we look around these days, what do we see? Lots of people filled with zeal, whether it's Victoria Nuland of the State Department, whether it's Donald Trump or Rubio or Ted Cruz, people filled with zeal, apparently well-meaning, though in some cases I do have to wonder, but without understanding. They sacrifice the greater good for immediate personal gain. And those people are always dangerous. Brandeis notes, and this is the key bit, decency, security, and liberty alike demand that government officials shall be subjected to the same rules of conduct that are commands to the citizen. Decency, security, and liberty alike demand that government officials shall be subjected to the same rules of conduct that are commands to the citizen. Wouldn't that be something to say? In a government of laws, Brandeis continues, existence of the government will be imperiled if it fails to observe the law scrupulously. Our government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Crime is contagious. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. It invites every man to become a law unto himself. It invites anarchy. To declare that in the administration of the criminal law, the end justifies the means, to declare that government may commit crimes in order to secure the conviction of a private criminal would bring a terrible retribution. Against that pernicious doctrine, this court should resolutely set its face. Strong words. The government is the potent, the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches the whole people by its example. Thus it should be, but thus it is not. It is not at all. What do we have instead of justice? What do we have instead of recognizing law and recognizing the necessity of equity before the law? Instead of this, what do we have? Lies, obfuscations, manipulations, lame justifications for murder, for theft, for destruction, for shredding the Constitution to build a security state. Lies and manipulations which poison the national discourse. Government lies at the top, and deceit and loss of trust trickle down. I keep thinking of the Leonard Cohen song, Everybody Knows. Everybody knows the boat is leaking. Everybody knows the captain lied. Everybody got this sinking feeling like their father or their dog just died. The whole social fabric of human society, as far back as we have recorded language, has hinged on good faith and trust among people. What happens when good faith and trust are eroded at the top? Does suspicion and enmity trickle down? Why would it not? Where is a reciprocity of equity of ordinary people? If it's not observed by our government, where can it be observed? In our land. Reciprocity, good faith, and trust. Brandeis may overstate things when he says that violence and lawlessness increase. It may not be violence and lawlessness, but it is a moral chasm that separates group from group and causes them to view each other with suspicion. It is a chasm of privilege that gives some peoples, especially white peoples with penises, a right, a power to act without having to really be answerable for it. I read in the Washington Post the other day, violence is actually down. Murder rate in the U.S. per capita is actually down over what it was 20 years ago. So maybe it's not that kind of violence, but maybe it's that very real violence that people do when they lie, that people do when they distrust, that people do when they judge others based on some prejudice, and release the most acidic, caustic effect on the social bond that should tie us into community. And is this even accidental, or is this in fact deliberate? Because as long as you've got black people scared of cops and white people, and you've got white people terrified of blacks, and you've got Christians terrified of Muslims, you have a nation divided. And what did Lincoln say about a nation divided? It cannot stand. I mean, only the blind can fail to see this, can see how corrosive the situation is. I keep thinking back, I think about songs a lot. I was thinking back to a Zappa song on, oh golly, what was the album? I think it was We're Only In It For The Money. But there was a song in there that had the lyrics, "It can't happen here, it can't happen here, no freaks for us, it can't happen here." And later on in the same song is the phrase, "Scab of a nation, driven insane." There is a kind of madness upon us. There is a kind of madness upon us. The madness that leads us to consume mindlessly, that leads us to abandon any life of the mind, that leads us to abandon community and retreat into a phosphorescent screen. Only the blind can fail to see it. Yet under all, still is this strange belief in USA, USA, which may not be a bad thing, as long as it's not about the current condition. If we could get back to the idea of a people's government, if we could get back to the idea of holding our leaders to the law, holding them accountable to law, and our bankers, if we could get back to holding men, for example, accountable to the rules of reciprocity and mutual respect with women, if we could get back to the laws of mutuality, mutual respect and trust that should govern relations between religions, we'd be in a very, very different place. Instead, we play this very strange game, domestically, internationally. This is a very noisy notebook I have going on here. You know, we look at our politics. Our politics reveal as clearly as anything, or this political spectacle we call politics, reveal as clearly as anything the lunacy and the hubris that exist at the top levels of governance. We've got the neocons and the neolibs who are running foreign policy, blowing up everything in sight, trying to conquer the world. And then we have this smaller manifestation of it taking place on the screens. And this, the funny thing about people who try to conquer the world, the kind of people who want to have these endless wars that go on and on and on, that enrich them hugely, and that prostituted office of Congress, that prostituted branch of government that we call Congress, which is now available for all to see as a prostitute industry at the hands of at the service of the oligarchs. How can we fail to see in these ideas the hubris? How can we fail to see the hubris, which of course always draws forth nemesis? Nemesis always appears following hubris. Back to our elections, which Tom Engelhardt calls the 1% elections. And as he notes, the first primaries are tryouts in front of billionaires. Tryouts in front of billionaires. And now the season starts a full 2 years before the elections? Seriously? Seriously? Why? Because it can be wound into a bigger and bigger spectacle. Or as Engelhardt calls it, a spectac election. Specta election, of which he notes Donald Trump is the spawn. So how crazy can it get? How wound up can it get? How much nonsense can be spoken? And you see nothing much improved from the leading Democratic candidate. Spectacle. Spectacle, spectacle, spectacle. Are we lost in a spectacle? Are we lost in what Guy Debord called the spectacular society, where everything is rumor and illusion? Everything is hearsay. Nothing's quite real. But we all act like it is. Well, certainly that's the way we seem to watch our news. And what is the spectacle? Sport, entertainment, the news so-called, which is largely entertainment. No one actually does much real news anymore, except at the local level where it can be kind of good. Entertainment, sport, news. This is our world. This is what govern our rationalities, so-called. And our rationalities are completely irrational, as are those of our leaders. And this is where society fails, from the lies at the top, from the distortions of reality. When the rationalities, little plans that we have about how things work and what we're going to do, are lies, are betrayals, are in fact destructive. We're number one. Remember, hubris is the seeking to have more than is your just share. Trying to have too much, to disturb the distribution of fortune, if you will. And this invokes nemesis, or as Scripture says, pride goeth before a fall. Lost in our spectacles, what are the tropes? What are the stories of our spectacles? Of power, control, violence. These certainly stem from the top. Power, control, and violence. And a fantasy that somehow through magic power and violence, we as individuals can transform the world. And I wonder what it will take to actually wake up people in this country. I mean, is it like an alcoholic that we have to hit bottom first? That we have to hear the angel wings rustling above us? Well, they're rustling now. They're rustling in the sounds of a dying planet. They're rustling in the sounds of a decaying social order. They're rustling in the sounds of a loss of faith and joy and reciprocity, mutuality. You see, finally, at bottom, we're all personally responsible for ourselves. But not just for ourselves. We're also responsible for those around us. Our neighbors, our families, our communities. We are responsible. But we don't want to believe it. We really have to hit bottom to learn this lesson? Do we really? We are responsible for our own government. But we don't step up to the plate. We don't take that responsibility seriously. Lies and obfuscation. Do you remember Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 that was shot down last year over Ukraine, killing 238 people and 238 passengers, 283, passengers and 15 crew? And the Dutch have been doing this big investigation, and they've released a report leaned on heavily by the West, leaned on heavily by people who want to see a particular outcome. Did the investigation, did the Russians shoot it down? Did the Ukraine? Nobody's going to say the Ukrainians did it. Certainly not, except for the crazy, evil Russians. Funny thing happened on the way to criminal trials. The Australian Federal Police and the Dutch police and prosecutors investigating the cause believe, quote, the Dutch Safety Board has failed to provide conclusive evidence of what type of munition destroyed the aircraft. Testifying for the first time in international court, Detective Superintendent Andrew Donahue, the senior Australian policeman in the international MH17 investigation, said, a tougher standard than the DSB report, Dutch Safety Board report, is required before the criminal investigation can identify the weapon which brought the aircraft down or pinpoint the perpetrators. Donahue also said, quote, Dutch prosecutors require conclusive evidence on other types of missiles. Initial information that the aircraft was shot down by a Buk surface-to-air missile does not meet the Australian or international standard of evidence. Now I bring this up partly because it's an interesting article. It's nice to see things are slowly moving along with that investigation. But also, you'll note that there's nothing on this in the U.S. press today. Nothing. And there won't be anything tomorrow in all likelihood, because this is one of those stories that's supposed to go away. Like the attempted U.S. coup. Well, actually, the successful U.S. coup in Ukraine, which removed a legally elected government, installed Yatsenyuk and Poroshenko, and it's just, and they've run the country into the ground. They've now got Saakashvili, who can't even go back to his home country of Georgia, as a governor of one of the provinces. But this is another story we're not supposed to remember. We're supposed to fall into the amnesia. We're supposed to fall into thinking about being blown up by Muslims, or thinking about black people going to kill us, or police are going to kill us, or whatever madness it is we're supposed to be afraid of. Whatever. Paul Craig Roberts, former administrator in the Reagan administration, in an article from December 13th of this year, which is available in numerous sites makes the argument that even though we daily observe aggressive actions taken by Washington and its vassals against Russia and China, even though we daily observe this, we don't get it. We don't get it. Washington continues to blame Russia for the destruction of MH17, he writes, while preventing an honest investigation of the attack on a Malaysian airliner. Washington continues to force its European vassals to impose sanctions on Russia on the false claim that the conflict in Ukraine was caused by a Russian invasion of Ukraine, not by Washington's coup. What this shows, again, Mr. Roberts, what this shows and what should concern us is that the institutions of Western civilization are in fact tools of American dominance. The institutions are not there for the noble reasons stated in the founding documents. Well, he's not the first person to say this. You go back to Smedley Butler, who resigned as a brigadier general of the Marine Corps after 30 years of service, saying he was tired of being a bagman for the corporations. Neocon Washington, writes Roberts, relies on lies and propaganda and has many more and much louder voices than Russia. And if you follow some of the Russian statements, especially statements by President Putin, they're largely fact-based and truth-based, and he's pretty straightforward in saying what he is about. And what is the U.S. response to this? Well, Hillary Clinton said, there's an information war and we're losing to Russia. Oh, look at all this evil Russian propaganda. Everything you hear from Russia is propaganda, which is exactly what liars say. Oh, I'm telling you the truth. Everyone else is lying. It's exactly how this works. Russia was misled, writes Roberts, by believing that the West respects and abides by the values that it professes. In fact, these Western values are merely a cover for the unbridled evil of which the West consists. The Western peoples are so dim-witted that they have not yet understood that the war on terror is in fact a war to create terror that can be exported to Muslim areas of Russia and China in order to destabilize the two countries that serve as a check on Washington's unilateral hegemonic power. He continues, unless Russia and China are content to be Washington's vassal states, for the neoconservatives who control Washington, and thereby the West, to press these two powerful countries so hard can only lead to war, as Washington is not a match for Russia and China in conventional war. The war will be nuclear, and the result will be the end of life on Earth. We've already committed acts of war against Russia through our proxies in Turkey, shooting down a Russian jet. It's emerged that one of our AWACS was supplying information to the Turks, who popped out, ambushed it in a trap, shot it down, and raced for home as quick as they could go. This was an act of war committed by Washington and Turkey, writes Mr. Roberts, and thereby Washington's European NATO vassal states against a nuclear power capable of exterminating all life on Earth in every one of the countries, including the superpower U.S. This simple fact should make even the American super patriots who wear the flag on their sleeve wonder about the trust they place in their government and in Fox News, CNN, NPR, and the rest of the prostitutes who continually lie every minute of every broadcast. The oligarchs make fortunes from their lies to us. And sometimes we even know we're being cheated. And on some level, we feel that cheated and wronged, but the sleight of hand of having a ready scapegoat or some pretty shiny war somewhere that can take all of that anger and passion and give it a focus. This ready scapegoat of a war prevents us from admitting the truth even to ourselves. We sink further and further into denial and have that much more enmity to project outward. Because the more in denial people go, a part of them is monitoring the depth to which they sink into denial. And this causes conflict and anger and depression. And how nice to have a nice shiny enemy to project this onto. And thus, the cycle continues. So, back to Mr. Brandeis. Decency and liberty alike demand that government officials shall be subjected to the same rules of conduct that are commands to the citizen. Decency, security, and liberty. Well, at least two of those words still get rattled around now and again. Security and liberty, we're all about that. What happened to decency? What happens to that? And what is the terrible retribution that will come to government that commits crimes that lets the ends justify the means, that breaks the law when it wants to. What is this terrible retribution that Justice Brandeis spoke of? Sounds like nemesis to me. And that concludes today's show. You've been listening to Long Waves Radio with Gary Krug. I'll be back next week. But let me just say a couple of things here before I go. First of all, if you've got a car, truck, or boat, give us a call. We'll have it picked up. You will get a nice tax deduction. KYRS will get a little bit of money to help keep us on the air. We are almost completely reliant on our listeners to keep us on the air. We have no commercials. And this is an easy way to do it. Donate your car, truck, boat, running or not. We'll have it picked up. You get the tax receipt. To do this, simply call 855-597-7227. Well, you can listen to podcasts of these shows on YouTube, Long Waves Radio. Put it all in quotes. You'll turn it right over. Find me on Facebook, Long Waves Radio. And you can also write longwaves at kyrs.org. Thank you again for listening. Until next week, ponder, feel, think, turn off your damn TVs, read. I'll be back with more. Bye-bye.